This wasn't cost-cutting, it was treason. John Deere didn't just outsource jobs, they detonated the heart of rural America. Overnight, factories went silent, farms froze, and entire towns were erased from the map. One boardroom decision, sold as strategy, triggered a collapse that politicians couldn't stop, and that Trump tried to punish with fire. But the real story? It didn't unfold on cable news. It unraveled in cornfields, county fairs, and shattered family legacies. So what happens when tractors cost more than homes? What do you do when your crops rot and no one comes to pick them? And what if the global food system has already replaced the United States without telling you? It wasn't just about economics. It was about loyalty and betrayal. Trump's strongest supporters weren't CEOs or stockholders. They were farmers, rural voters, factory workers in red states who filled his rallies with pickup trucks and "Make America Great Again" signs. The same people who bought John Deere equipment like it was a badge of patriotism. At a rally in Des Moines, Iowa, Trump didn't hold back. "John Deere just stabbed us in the back," he thundered. "They're sending your jobs to Mexico? Not on my watch." The crowd erupted in chants. He called it economic treason and vowed swift punishment. This isn't just about farming, it's about power. Because while America argued, the world quietly took over. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the US lost a $34.5 billion empire without firing a single shot. What's happening? The news of John Deere's outsourcing move didn't just reach Donald Trump, it hit him like a direct insult. And then came the line that would make headlines across the globe. "We're putting a 200% tariff on every single piece of John Deere equipment made outside the United States." It was classic Trump, bold, unapologetic, and devastating. The crowd cheered like it was a declaration of war, but behind the scenes, Wall Street flinched. Economists gasped, and corporate boardrooms panicked, because Trump wasn't bluffing. Within 48 hours, his trade team began drafting language for an emergency tariff targeting John Deere's outsourced production. Legal teams debated loopholes, markets dipped, equipment manufacturers scrambled to reposition. At first, rural communities celebrated. They thought the tariffs would force Deere to return, to restore jobs, to undo the betrayal. For a brief moment, Trump's base believed justice had arrived. But the relief didn't last long, because 2 weeks later, the prices started rising. Farmers looking to buy a new combine saw prices jump by tens of thousands of dollars. Repairs on imported parts doubled. Dealerships that depended on seasonal orders couldn't keep up. The tariffs weren't just hurting Deere, they were crushing the very people Trump wanted to protect. And that's when farmers, Trump's base, began to turn. Farmers burned the green machine. For over a century, farmers stood by John Deere even through rising-priced software restrictions and corporate mergers. But now, the green and yellow had become a symbol of betrayal. And rural America responded in a way no one expected. In Missouri, a local farm store went viral after painting over its massive Deere sign with the words "sold out." In South Dakota, farmers uploaded TikTok videos of themselves torching Deere hats. On YouTube, a farmer named Clay posted a 40-minute breakdown of how he dismantled his old John Deere combine and rebuilt it using third-party parts, just to prove he could survive without them. But this wasn't just about anger, it was about survival. For years, John Deere had made itself increasingly hostile to its own customers through restrictive right-to-repair policies. Farmers couldn't fix their own equipment without going through authorized dealerships. Software locks, proprietary diagnostics, and sky-high service fees had been tolerated, until now. The outsourcing decision was the final straw. Across the Midwest, farmers began turning to competitors. Kubota, Case IH, AGCO, brands that allowed more flexibility, brands that hadn't moved their factories to foreign countries, and most importantly, brands that hadn't insulted the intelligence and patriotism of the American farmer. Dealerships felt the shift immediately. Trade-ins dropped. Inventory piled up. Service centers saw a spike in demand for older, non-digital machines that didn't require locked diagnostics. Resale value of John Deere equipment plummeted. It wasn't just a boycott, it was a cultural funeral. Because for farmers, this wasn't about tractors, it was about trust. And once that trust was broken, no amount of advertising, discounts, or empty apologies could fix it. But it wasn't just the buyers who were betrayed. The builders were next. If this story already has you thinking twice about what's really happening in America, pause right here and hit that subscribe button. The workers who built Deere and got buried by it. In Waterloo, Iowa, the factory had been running for over 100 years. Generations of families worked under the same roof, wore the same green uniforms, and punched in on the same floor. For them, John Deere wasn't just an employer. It was their entire way of life. And then, overnight, it was gone. Layoff notices were delivered by email. Managers cried during shift changes. Retirement benefits were frozen. Plants that had once been the economic engine of small towns were reduced to silence. Their gates chained shut and security cameras pointed outward. For the workers, it wasn't just about losing a paycheck. It was about losing dignity, losing a place in the world. Unions mobilized immediately. The United Auto Workers staged walkouts and filed emergency grievances. Protesters held signs that read, "Deere killed our town," and "Bring our jobs home." National media arrived, capturing footage of lifelong employees standing in front of shuttered plants, some too angry to speak, others too broken. But John Deere refused to back down. Executives stood by their decision, citing global competitiveness. In boardrooms, they referred to the layoffs as a necessary transition. On the ground, people called it abandonment. Local economies spiraled. Property values fell. School budgets were slashed. Suicide hotlines reported spikes in call volume. Foreclosures doubled. In the towns Deere built, everything died when the jobs disappeared. And with no workers and no trust, the machines stopped moving, literally. The factories had gone quiet. The farmers were in revolt. But what came next was bigger than outrage. It was a total collapse of the farming system itself. How a tractor became a six-figure nightmare. It happened almost overnight. One moment, a new mid-sized tractor cost a struggling farmer around $60,000. The next, that same machine carried a sticker price well above $100,000. And the hit didn't stop there. Thanks to a single executive decision at John Deere, paired with a political overcorrection from the White House, the most essential tool in farming was suddenly priced like a luxury supercar. When John Deere shifted its manufacturing base to Mexico in an attempt to cut labor costs, it triggered immediate backlash. But the fallout went far beyond politics. Trump's retaliation, a 200% tariff on every John Deere machine built outside the United States, set off a shockwave through the agricultural economy. The policy may have targeted the company, but it struck the people who relied on that equipment hardest, the farmers. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Tariffs increased the cost of importing Deere's Mexican-built tractors and harvesters by tens of thousands of dollars per unit. The company, facing sudden production bottlenecks and political heat, began shifting more of its operations offshore, while simultaneously hiking prices across its entire product line. The result was pure economic chaos. The problem wasn't just the sticker price, it was everything behind it. With manufacturing split across borders, parts that were once available from domestic warehouses now had to be shipped across checkpoints, inspected at customs, and subjected to international freight costs. Supply chains became tangled in red tape, and dealers reported months-long delays for simple repairs. A hydraulic pump that used to cost $2,000 and arrive in a week could now take 2 months and cost triple. It was the beginning of a slow-motion train wreck. Tractors, the mechanical heart of American farming, had become six-figure nightmares. But for the farmers who somehow still managed to buy one, there was one more problem waiting in the field. And that problem? You could own the machine, but there was no one left to drive it. The immigration crackdown that left fields empty. If there's one truth about American agriculture that politicians rarely admit out loud, it's this. Without immigrant labor, much of it undocumented, our entire farming system collapses. For decades, the hands that picked our strawberries, pruned our peaches, and hauled our harvests were not born in Des Moines or Bakersfield. They came from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. They worked long hours for low wages, often without benefits or protection. And without them, the fields don't just go quiet. They rot. When Trump intensified his crackdown on undocumented immigrants, it was framed as a law and order measure. But on the ground, in the literal dirt of American farms, it was something else entirely, a labor apocalypse. Border enforcement surged. Immigration and customs enforcement ramped up its raids. Deportations increased. Fear spread like wildfire through rural communities. One farmer in California's Central Valley described watching a field of perfectly ripe tomatoes shrivel under the sun. His usual crew of 40 workers had vanished in a week, gone, deported, or too scared to return. Another in Arizona recalled losing his entire melon crop after only half of his workers showed up for harvest. It wasn't just anecdotal. The United States Department of Agriculture estimated that by the year 2022, over 70% of U.S. farm workers were foreign-born, and a majority were undocumented. When they disappeared, so did the food. The impact rippled through the supply chain. Harvest yields plummeted. Food processing plants received less product. Transport companies sat idle. Wholesale markets reported shortages. Grocery store prices rose, and while the news focused on political rallies and rhetoric, the real damage was playing out in silent, rotting fields. And yet, even for the farmers who had working equipment and a full crew, there was one more gut punch waiting for them, because suddenly their crops weren't worth anything. The price crash that bankrupted the heartland. For generations, American farmers had counted on one simple truth. If you planted your seeds, worked your land, and made it to harvest, you'd get paid. The market might shift, prices might fluctuate, but food was always in demand. That truth died somewhere between 2022 and 2024. What replaced it was a nightmare of overproduction, trade chaos, and economic bloodletting. It began with global saturation. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, long considered emerging competitors, exploded their output thanks to government investment, new infrastructure, and mechanization. India ramped up soybean and wheat production, and Russia began flooding markets with barley and corn. Global crop volume reached record highs, while demand remained flat. Prices nosedived. Corn fell by more than 37%. Soybeans dropped by 24%. Wheat tumbled by over 35%. For American farmers already crushed by equipment costs, labor shortages, and rising interest rates. This wasn't just a market correction, it was obliteration. Farmers were faced with impossible choices. They could overproduce to make up for the loss per bushel, but that required more fuel, more equipment, and more labor, all of which had become impossibly expensive. Or they could scale back, reduce acreage, and pray prices rebounded. But scaling back meant losing economies of scale, weakening their loan eligibility, and falling behind corporate megafarms that could afford to ride out the storm. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, John Deere made an announcement. They weren't backing down, they were doubling down. And their answer to the collapse? Robots. Robots don't save farming, they replace it. As farmers went bankrupt and communities crumbled, John Deere unveiled its future, a fleet of autonomous tractors, drones, and AI-powered farming tools designed to operate with zero human input. The company framed it as a revolution, a bold step into precision agriculture. But for most farmers, it felt like an eviction notice. The headline piece of this new era was Deere's autonomous four-wheel drive tractor, capable of planting, fertilizing, and harvesting without a driver. Guided by GPS, sensors, and machine learning, it could run 24 hours a day with no breaks. On paper, it sounded like salvation, until you saw the price tag, over $500,000. That wasn't a tractor. It was a dividing line. Only the largest, wealthiest, corporate-run farms could afford Deere's new tech. The rest, they were left behind. Subscription models locked farmers into expensive monthly payments. Proprietary software prevented independent repair. Drone and sensor integration required ongoing training and costly upgrades. Farming was no longer just hard work. It was a high-tech arms race, and the winners were already picked. Traditional farmers, already stretched thin, couldn't buy in. Their older equipment couldn't sync with the new systems. Their land wasn't mapped for AI control. Their budgets couldn't absorb $500,000 purchases. What Deere called innovation felt more like segregation, dividing agriculture into two worlds, one hyper-automated, data-driven, and corporate, and the other left to die. The company that once built the machines of American prosperity was now building the architecture of its replacement, and with no land, no labor, and no ownership. Climate chaos finished what Deere started. Climate chaos finished what Deere started. The American farmer has always had to battle the elements. But what's happening now isn't just another bad season. It's an existential threat. The climate isn't shifting, it's breaking. In the past decade alone, the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events have exploded. Droughts now stretch for years, not months. Floods arrive not as seasonal annoyances, but as historic catastrophes. In the year 2019, the Mississippi River Basin saw floods that caused more than $20 billion in crop damage. And in California, since the year 2018, over 4 million acres of farmland have been consumed by wildfires. Many of them started by lightning, drought-fueled blazes that move faster than farmers can flee. These aren't isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a global shift. Average temperatures in the Midwest have risen significantly since the year 2015, altering rainfall patterns and pushing growing zones north. What once was fertile corn country is now a patchwork of struggling fields and failed harvests. Rain comes too hard, too late, or not at all, and when it does, it drowns instead of nourishes. Farmers can no longer plan. The old models, planting schedules, harvest timelines, crop rotation patterns are breaking down. The weather doesn't care what month it is. It doesn't care that a farmer just took out a $200,000 loan to buy seed that now won't germinate. Insurance premiums have skyrocketed, but even payouts can't undo the damage when the crop is gone, and the bank still wants its money. And the consequences ripple far beyond the fields. When crops fail, prices spike. Not just for the farmer, but for every family in America buying groceries. Wheat, corn, soy, these are the building blocks of the food supply. And when they disappear or become volatile, food insecurity spreads like a virus. Suddenly, a drought in Iowa means higher grocery bills in New York. And the voters who once cheered those moves, they were about to snap. Because while America debated, lobbied, and politicked, the rest of the world was already moving on. Europe's revenge, a farming superpower, rises. When the United States farming sector began to collapse under the weight of corporate greed, climate disaster, and political backlash, European leaders didn't mourn the loss. They saw an opening and launched a coordinated counterattack to seize control of global agricultural influence. For years, the European Union had watched from the sidelines as the U.S. flooded the world with cheap grain, high-tech farming equipment, and cultural dominance rooted in the American farm. But now, with John Deere in free fall and American exports drying up, the EU moved swiftly, strategically, and without hesitation. The first blow came in the form of tariffs. In a matter of weeks, the European Union announced a 25% surcharge on all American-grown corn, soybeans, and wheat entering the European market. On the surface, it was framed as a retaliation against Trump-era isolationist policies. But the reality was far more calculated. By pricing American goods out of competitiveness, the EU cleared the way for its own farmers to reclaim lost ground. This wasn't protectionism. It was surgical economic warfare. At the same time, France, Spain, and Germany passed a historic joint agricultural stimulus package worth more than $27 billion. These funds were poured directly into domestic farms, modernizing equipment, increasing yield, and making sure no EU farmer was left unable to compete with collapsing American prices. Farmers in France suddenly had access to interest-free loans. German producers received grants to expand infrastructure and automate logistics. Spanish cooperatives were funded to open new export facilities in the Mediterranean. Every euro invested wasn't just about farming, it was about conquest. But Europe's power play wasn't limited to within its borders. It extended outward in all directions. Trade envoys were dispatched to Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia with one mission: replace American agricultural partnerships with European ones. New deals were inked with Nigeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco. Where once these nations relied on U.S. wheat and soy, they now secured exclusive pricing and guaranteed shipments from the European Union. EU-branded grain and equipment began flooding into ports that used to unload John Deere crates and American corn sacks. While the White House argued over tariffs and subsidies, the European Union cast itself as the last stable superpower in agriculture. Their leaders branded themselves not only as exporters, but as the protectors of food security. In speeches across the globe, European politicians emphasized sustainability, fairness, and resilience. And for buyers burned by U.S. volatility, the pitch landed. America looked chaotic. Europe looked reliable. Europe didn't just capitalize on America's collapse. They orchestrated a new order, one that made the United States irrelevant. And Europe wasn't the only one rising. Latin America takes the throne. As the U.S. agriculture sector spiraled into chaos, Brazil and Argentina didn't wait for the dust to settle. They struck immediately. And by the time America realized what was happening, Latin America had already become the new food basket of the world. In Brazil, the government launched a $10 billion investment wave, aimed at transforming its agricultural infrastructure. New highways were carved through farm-rich states like Mato Grosso. Railways were expanded to slash transportation time to export terminals. Ports in Santos and Paranagua were modernized to handle unprecedented volumes of soybeans, corn, and coffee. Brazil had long been a rising agricultural power, but now it was positioned to replace the United States altogether. Argentina, meanwhile, took a different but equally strategic route. In a bold legislative move, its government slashed export taxes by 15% and introduced direct subsidies for farm equipment, fertilizer, and diesel. For Argentine farmers, it was a green light to expand operations. Thousands of small and mid-sized farms upgraded to commercial scale in under 2 years. Production exploded. The timing couldn't have been better. With John Deere equipment prices soaring in the US and shipping routes backed up by chaos, buyers around the world looked for alternatives. Brazil and Argentina didn't just meet demand, they undercut the United States on price and beat them to delivery. By the end of the year 2024, Brazil had overtaken the US. It wasn't just winning on crops, it also started dominating the equipment war. Brazilian and Argentine manufacturers, many of them working with Chinese and European partners, began rolling out tractors, combines, and harvesters that were 30 to 40% cheaper than anything coming from John Deere. These machines weren't as high-tech, but they were durable, easy to repair, and available now. For global buyers trying to survive inflation and supply chain turmoil, that was all that mattered. But the biggest threat to John Deere didn't come from America's backyard. It came from the other side of the world. India's Mahindra replaces the American tractor. In the background of America's farm system meltdown, India's Mahindra Group launched a silent campaign that would change the global agricultural equipment landscape forever. As the US fought with itself and Brazil took control of global grain markets, Mahindra did something different. It filled the vacuum left by John Deere, one tractor at a time. Backed by over $4 billion in modernization programs, Mahindra expanded rapidly. The Indian government provided export incentives, subsidized manufacturing, and pushed Mahindra into trade talks with dozens of countries. But this wasn't just about scale. It was about strategy. Mahindra didn't aim for the top of the market. It aimed for the middle, the space Deere had abandoned. Mahindra tractors cost 40% less than John Deere equivalents. They were simpler to operate, easier to repair, and designed for small to mid-size farms, the kind America had left behind. Where Deere locked farmers into proprietary software and service contracts, Mahindra handed them wrenches and full access. By 2025, Mahindra was the largest tractor manufacturer by volume in the world. Its reach extended into Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and even Latin America. Mahindra signed deals with rural co-ops, created financing programs with flexible interest rates, and built service centers in places Deere never touched. It wasn't just selling tractors, it was building trust. For farmers burned by American inflation and European complexity, Mahindra was a godsend. A machine that worked, didn't bankrupt them, and didn't come with geopolitical baggage. Mahindra didn't conquer the industry with noise, it conquered it with presence. And in that moment, America lost more than exports. It lost its identity. The day America lost its agricultural crown. For over 100 years, American farmers fed the world. They exported more grain, owned more land, and used the most advanced machinery. John Deere was more than a company. It was a symbol of American strength. But by 2027, that symbol had shattered. Quietly, quickly, and completely. U.S. agricultural exports fell by over 30%. Nations that once depended on American crops were now signing deals with Europe, Brazil, and India. Markets that had been carved out over decades were lost in a matter of months. American farmers weren't just outpriced, they were outmaneuvered. With the fall of exports came the collapse of global leadership. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, once a powerful voice in international food policy, found itself sidelined in major global summits. Even the World Food Program shifted its equipment preferences away from American machines and toward Mahindra and Brazilian brands. The most painful part? This didn't happen over 20 years. It happened in 5. And it all started with one company's decision to leave and one man's decision to retaliate. That's the story they didn't want you to hear. One company, one tariff, and an entire industry is gone. But what do you think? Can American farming be saved, or is it already too late? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, ones that expose the truth behind the headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications.